Let us now bring in our next speaker. He is a UI engineer, he is a game designer, he is a qualified automotive mechanic, he has studied psychology and also holds a master's degree in interaction design and electronic arts. And yes, he is one single person. Truly, people with passion make the impossible happen. Please put your hands together for Max.
Thank you, Katie, for that wonderful introduction. Right. So for the past 5 years, I've had a side hustle called Dream Stage Studios, which has taught me a whole bunch about game development and CGI. I want to share with you how a game development pipeline looks. So the next time you see a game or anything with CGI like a movie, you'll be looking at it with a completely different lens. Or maybe this will inspire you to take up one of the mediums within the pipeline as a new form of art or hobby. So my talk is called Game Development, a combination of all mediums, and there's about 10 topics that I'm going to cover. So let's jump into the first one, which is story creation. So story creation is a really important first part of game development, as it's really going to help you start to concept what your game is going to be about, what type of interesting characters are going to be involved, are there any environments and places to go. Why I think a game's story stands out from things like books or movies is because the player actually gets to be in the shoes of the hero or villain. There's also the multiplayer aspect in games, which creates a lot of different problems for story writers to deal with. In fact, some games actually allow players to generate the stories for their games and create the history for other players in the future to experience online. So once you have your story, you can jump into concepting. So we made a game a couple years ago called Fruit Fat. You see it on the right-hand side there. It's quite a simple game, but we still came up with a story to help the concepting stage of this game. And the story just goes like this. It's a hamster. He collects fruit. He brings it into this tree. He cooks it and he eats it and he gets fat from the fruit. So this kind of helped us get a couple mechanics out the window, and we put a couple cool features like the color of the smoke that comes out of the tree changes color based on the fruit he's recently caught, and that's like he's cooking the fruit in that tree or something. So once you've got your concepts out of the way, you can get into creating your actual assets. And one of the fundamentals here is modeling. And you can see one of my models up in the top right corner, which is an Audi R8. So the way I put that one together is by putting about 300,000 polygons. And it's quite a defined model because it's basically a one-to-one replica of the real car, and pretty much using the reference from the front, the back, and the side of the vehicle, which I got from the actual engineering schematics. I would just move around the vertices, the edges, and the faces, much like the video you're seeing here on the screen, to pretty much build out that model. Now, you can also do what's called sculpting, much like clay sculpting, and this requires models that are very, very high in polygons. I'm talking in the millions, and that's how you'll get your very organic and biological models out, right? So in a standard game, though, you'll probably have models that are only about 30 to 40,000 polygons, and simple props like teacups and plates may only be in the lower end of the hundreds. So once you've got your models, you'll move on to texturing. You can see our game ColorBot in the top right corner there of the screen, and the maps that make that robot look the way it looks is right here in the middle. So usually on a model, you have several maps which control the colors, the glossiness, the metallicness, the shadows, the lighting, and all of this comes together in the end to give you the look of the model. And this needs to pretty much be first cut off the model itself and then wrapped back onto it. So if you're wondering how you would do something like that with a humanoid model as opposed to a cube like you see at the bottom right corner, well, you can just look at your own clothes and look at the seams on your clothes, right? That is generally where you would start to cut open a model that's a humanoid before you turn it into a 2D texture map and start painting on top of it. So once you've got your model and it's textured up nicely, you'll do a thing called rigging, and this is a very technical and complex procedure. So it pretty much requires very good knowledge of anatomy. You may as well be a doctor at this point, because what you're really doing is reconstructing a skeleton and you're building the hierarchy. So imagine you want your elbow to follow your shoulder, your wrist to follow your elbow, and your hand to follow your wrist. Then the fingers also kind of get quite complicated. And you really need to get that hierarchy correct, otherwise things are going to go quite haywire. So then you would, once you have your skeleton, you need to do a thing called painting the skin weights, and this is kind of like building the muscles. So what would happen is you would get a paintbrush-like tool and paint in the locations of the mesh and connect the polygons to the correct bones. All right. Once you've done that, you can start building your animator controls, and that helps the animator animate the model without worrying all of that complicated rigging that was done beforehand. So where does it really get technical? Well, imagine rigging something like an octopus. All right, you better have a couple books handy for that. So once your rigging is all said and done, you move on to your animation. And animation really works how it's always worked. If you ever had a book and you fill a couple pages with the same character but different pose every single piece of paper and flip through it really quickly, you'll get your animation. So it works pretty much the same way today, but the computer helps you a lot. What you really generally do is just get a couple good hero poses to the computer. So if you're doing a run, like at the bottom right corner, you just have the takeoff, the middle pose with the leg halfway up, and then the landing, and the computer will fill all the in-betweens for you. That'll look quite robotic. So we do have a concept called easing in and easing out, which helps make things look a little bit more organic. Because if you look at how people move, there's always some fluidity to it, and it's generally you're slowing down into things and you're speeding out of them as well, right? And you also have this concept of motion capture, which is, if you're like Jackie Chan or you're a black belt in karate, gymnast, this is great for you. And you pretty much put a suit on a person like that, have a couple sensors hooked up. I actually did this in my bachelor degree, and it's pretty cool. It goes into the computer quite well, and these days we can actually ditch the suit and just do it with a camera, because computer vision is just so great these days. So finally, once you have all of those assets created and you've done all those steps, you'll do the asset importation. This is usually done by a technical artist on the team, and this means bringing all of those assets in. So the models, the texture maps, the animations, the rigs, and then having them all work together while keeping their quality up through things like shaders. And what you see here in this picture on this presentation is, you've got hundreds of models here, and they're really modeled to architect level of detail, and they're also all moving. I can guarantee you, if you walk into one of those buildings, you will see clocks that are ticking, right? Like the actual time. And of course, Batman himself is all animated, modeled, textured, and what you're looking at there is hundreds of thousands of hours of work. So with audio in games, I honestly think that game audio design is second to none, because in a game, everything you touch, every button that you press, every enemy that you see, every time your character changes in the way it's moving, there is a sound effect. Every button on the UI in the menu has a sound effect in the game. Plus, there's voiceovers, which are usually done by celebrities and whatnot. I just call up my brother because he's pretty good at giving me all types of funny grunts and breathing, and he's just great at making different voices too. So you have the user experience in games as well, but we kind of call it player experience. So we do a lot of player testing, and generally you have a lot of complicated systems like inventory management, which can get very crazy very quickly. But the main point I want to get across is the user experience in a game is a literal experience. It's a combination of everything I just spoke about: the art, the music, the environments, the story, and the overall journey of the player. So when you're designing a user experience, you are literally designing an experience for the players that are going to play your game. And with that experience, you have these user interfaces, and some games want to display a lot of data for players, and it can get messy very, very quickly. And you can see how complicated it is to really finesse a UI in some games. Now, some of these UIs are also comparable to complicated military systems. There's a couple images here of helicopters. Some are real, some are from a game. And I think the ones from a game are about 5 years old as well, so they're even better today. And I promise you, the consoles in the games that you see here are actually fully functioning. They all show you all the correct data that a real helicopter would as well. So finally, my favorite part, programming, which is connecting all of the pieces together, and it helps to know how everything works, of course, when you are doing this programming. So it's very logic based compared to other types of software, because even for something as simple as jumping, you can imagine, you need to see what button is pressed. Do they have this? Are they on the ground? Do they have a certain item? You got to play the sound at the right time. You need to activate the correct animation. That all stems from, is it in the correct animation state to even be activated? So you can see it gets quite deep in terms of logic, and you need to have a good understanding of vector space and physics, depending on if your game is 2D or 3D, to make anything move. So where do I think this is all going? Well, I've started to make an augmented reality game and a virtual reality game. You may have heard a lot of stuff about metaverse. Things like metaverse have been around for a long time. You have VR chat and things like this. But I believe that there will be big changes soon, and I think the main thing is decreasing the size of the virtual reality headsets to something like this. I've already seen a couple of things that are close, but when the virtual reality glasses are about this size, there will really be no point of even having an iPhone at that point. So game development is what drives my creativity and gets me to constantly do things like program, design, solve problems, and create. It's actually brought the people closest to me together, and I think that's because there are so many ways to participate in game development, from being a musician to an artist, a UX designer, a programmer, and everything in between. I hope this talk has opened up your eyes a bit in how much is really involved in making a game. And that concludes my talk, Game Development, a combination of all mediums.
I am absolutely spellbound. I'm sure everyone is. Thank you, Max, for showing what really goes into making games that make us forget complex realities and escape into a world of possibilities. Hope we'll get to see our own version of, say, League of Legends or a Grand Theft Auto soon. And to the gamers, do spend a few moments to appreciate the hard work that goes into making your favorite games. I would now like to request everyone to unmute yourself and give a big round of applause for our extremely impressive speakers. Thank you, everybody. Before I reveal the answer to the second trivia, let's hear it from our public speaking expert. Over to you, Emily.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, what did you? I didn't think you wanted me to say anything. Do you want me to just quickly give a brief overview?
Yep,
I
that
think
works.
both of the speakers were so interesting. I think it's fantastic to get such a personal look. So Peter, obviously the video was just so interesting, and I put on the chat like I felt like I was going left to right with that. So to bring it to life for us, I think was extremely interesting. And Max has given me, and I'm sure he's given everybody else, such an interesting perspective, either to look at games. I'm not a gamer, but now I will look at CGI and my daughter's cartoons in a completely new light. So, a great sort of escapism and a very interesting look into the lives of these two speakers.
Thank you, Emily. I'm sure people are making notes and will apply them in their next presentation.
Thanks, Gertie.
All right, now, so what is it, after all, that you earn if you know it and pay when you don't?